So anyway, my story begins, first generation born here in the United States. My grandparents were born and raised in Poland. My mother and uncle were born in Germany. Now what happened was, back in Poland, my grandparents knew of the impending German invasion to their town. So with that, my grandmother took all the things that were precious to her at the time, and at that time was her dress that she was married in and some jewelry, and went out into the field. Because in Poland, you know, they had jobs, but they were also all of them were farmers as well. So they went out to their field. She buried it in the ground, and then knelt over the area and prayed over it, and prayed that no German soldier would find the material, find the things that she held so precious. The only thing she held on to with her jewelry was her wedding band, and that's the thing that she never took off. She always kept that wedding band on her. This here is their wedding picture. And below here, you'll see, and we'll put it up here, this is their intake photo when they were captured and placed into the German camps. Now what happened was the Germans took over the village, the town, and they separated the occupants, men on one side, women and children on the other. And as they approached the desk where the soldier took their information and gave them their necessary documents, they'd ask them a couple of things, you know, what's your religion, what was your occupation, and they also asked to see their hands. So when my grandfather would walk up to the desk, the soldier said, "Let me see your hands." So my grandfather showed his hands, and he felt them, and he felt that they were rough and calloused, because although he was a police officer, again, being a farmer and working the fields, he was set to one side, and he said, you know, you're going to go into labor. Where my grandmother was on the other side, and said, you know, what was your occupation? And she said, school teacher. And they felt her hands, and she was very soft hands, so she was set aside to do a different task. The head of the camp, I don't recall, I don't think my grandparents knew his rank, but for the sake of the discussion, I'm going to refer to him as the captain, would go by and say, what did you do? What was your role in town? So again, my grandmother indicated that, you know, I was a school teacher. He asked her, so you can read and write in Polish? And she said, yes, I can. He says, can you read and write in German? And she says, enough to get by. Like she wasn't fluent in, but she knew enough. He says, I have a special assignment for you. You're going to come work for me. So she became his assistant in the camp, where my grandfather was put to hard labor. He was given a crucifix to wear on his lapel, because we were Catholic. And then, as well as my grandmother also had the crucifix attached to her that she always had to wear at all times. At one point, my grandfather tells me that his sister neglected to put that on her lapel. The soldiers found her without it, and my grandfather had to rush to her rescue and indicate, she's a Catholic, she's with me, she's my sister. And you know, they said, never are you to walk around the confines of the camp without this lapel affixed to you. So my grandmother was working with the captain in the headquarters of the camp. Her assignment was to, if he needed a letter dictated, she would write it. She would read him stories at the end of the day when he would relax. She would read him some stories in Polish or in German. Again, take some letters and things of that sort. My grandmother was also a poet, so she would also read him her poetry that she did. She would also talk about, you know, when she was looking out the window, she saw the lines of the men and women being ready to enter the chambers. She recalls these types of things, these horrors that she talked about. But she had to say that the captain, given the circumstances, was very good to her. And in essence, good to my grandfather. He would often pull her and say, here's a little something to bring back to your husband in the barracks. Whether it was a potato, a piece of bread, a roll. It says, go back and share it with your husband. But he warned her and says, do not let anybody know that you have this. Because if anyone were to catch you, I would have to say that you stole it, and then they would be punished for that. So that went for a number of years there. They were working there. And then people would come and go through the camps on the trains, and she always stayed because the captain took a liking to her, was very good to her. My grandmother would often talk about going back to the barracks that night and praying for him, because he was, given the circumstances, very kind to her. At one point, there was a lot of fighting going on in the neighboring towns, and then they were all put into a train car. And it was different this time. My grandmother, they were all crammed in there. There was a lot of fighting going on. And my grandmother looks at my grandfather and said, "This is different. They're killing everybody now. We're going to die," as the trains start to go away. She told me stories about how packed the train car was. They were up shoulder to shoulder against one another. Tensions in the train car were so high that, I guess given that situation, the townspeople, the fellow prisoners with my grandparents, very irritable, they're scared, they're malnourished, and they're arguing, they're yelling at each other. One time my grandmother indicated that a woman with a young child was in there, and of course the baby's crying, and the other people are yelling to the woman to shut that baby up, and just, they were scared, they didn't know what was happening. So as they're going, my grandfather's holding my grandmother, and they thought they were coming to the end because they started to hear a lot of shooting and shouting and things of that sort, so they thought this is what was going on, that they were opening up the train cars and letting people out and just massacring them as they were exiting. However, this time when the door opened, there was an American soldier said to the occupants in the train car where my grandparents were, it said, "We're Americans, we're American soldiers, you're now safe, come out." So they came out and they set up a camp there, and I believe the town was Kassel, Germany, because that's where my mother and uncle's birth certificate says that they were born in Kassel, Germany. My grandfather became very friendly with an American soldier, so much that when that soldier was sent back stateside after his tour of duty was concluded, he gave him his mess kit, his utensils, his knife, fork, and spoon, which I happen to have here. So, and they're stamped with the U.S. symbol on here. My grandfather, ever since this came into his possession, this never left his possession. For his remaining time at the camp, this is all that he would eat from. He would never eat from anything else. As the war started to come to its conclusion, there needed to be sponsorship to go somewhere else, so they weren't going to be staying in Germany. So my father's sister, one sister ended up in Canada, another sister ended up in Australia, and we were all set to go to Australia. Our paperwork was all done for my grandparents and my mother and uncle to go to Australia. However, at the last minute, before they started to leave, a fellow townsperson from Poland and with the camp with them, who ended up in the United States, sent word to my grandparents to come to America, because you needed a sponsor in America to come into the United States at that point. The sponsor had to agree to care for you for at least a year, provide you housing, and help you find employment. So they canceled their Australian plans and then decided to come to the United States. I believe landing somewhere initially in Newark, because that's where everybody landed, in Newark at that point in time. My grandfather worked in a factory, and I believe my grandmother also worked in the factory, but I believe this is Newark, it was A&P, and she was worked in the bakery at A&P for a number of years, and before settling into on her own in Irvington, and then they moved down to Shore after they retired. But again, going back here, my grandfather never used any other utensils other than this one. We could have Christmas dinner. Christmas Eve is a Polish tradition. Easter, Thanksgiving, whatever it was, would always be these utensils set up there. One thing I started to realize as I started to get older, because you never appreciate what you have until it's gone, so I never realized, as a child, the history that I had sitting right there with me the entire time, until much later in life, and I said, wow, if they were alive now for me to ask them all these questions. But again, they never really spoke much about it. In the Polish tradition, there's at these meals, Christmas Eve, the Thanksgiving, Easter, there was always a formal place-setting set that nobody sat at. And it was always for the weary traveler, in case your neighbor came by, you know, just a gesture of good faith that someone would come by. And as I was a little bit older, I would sit there and say, well, why is this here? You know, being 8, 9 years old, you just don't know. And my grandfather's story was that it was for the soldier. And I always thought that that was the tradition, it was for the soldier. But he always set the plate for his friend who gave him this mess kit, and hoping that one day he would be reunited and they would share a meal together. So after my grandfather would eat with these utensils, my grandmother would wash them and then set them aside on that plate for the gentleman if ever he were to come. When my grandparents became American citizens, I understand that was like a big joy in their life. They were so filled with patriotism for the United States. At one point, it was either the 76 or 1980 Olympics, because by 84 Olympics I was 14 and I knew everything at that point. But the United States was playing Poland in some sporting event. My grandfather would ask me, who am I rooting for? I'd say, Misha, who are you rooting for? And looking back now, I'm sure it was a loaded question. So I didn't know how to answer that, so I said, well, John, we're rooting for Poland. And he never really raised his voice until then. He says, Misha, we are Americans. You always root for America. There's no other country in the world except America, and that's who we root for. We always root for America. That just gives you the sense of pride that he always had as becoming an American citizen. So, in conclusion, that's my story. So while I never had the opportunity to serve, I am deeply indebted to those of you who have and those who continue to serve our country. And for that, I am forever thankful. And I know my grandparents are down looking at me now, telling their story, and I'm hoping that you know, I did it justice. So thank you for the opportunity. It was a truly an honor to speak to you. And again, thank you very much.